Hi everybody, this is Arkady Frekhtman. I'm a New York City personal injury trial attorney, and today we're talking about complex regional pain syndromes. A lot of clients have been asking about this, a lot of potential viewers, and it's a very serious, debilitating, lifelong injury that is painful and there's no cure for it. And this particular video, I wanted to look at an actual CRPS case that I litigated all the way from intake, when the client came in and told us what happened and we started a lawsuit, all the way through trial. And at trial, we tried to settle the case, but the offer was too low, so we had to take a jury verdict. And we ended up getting a pretty strong jury verdict. This was a mild case of CRPS in a young college student, a young girl. And she only had maybe a handful of medical visits, right? Like one or two hospital visits and then one visit to a doctor, and that was it. And so despite the fact that there was no medical treatment, we were able to get a jury verdict of more than $500,000. So I was going to go through some of the slides. These are the slides that we actually used in our opening statement and our closing argument in Supreme Court for the County of Kings, which is Brooklyn. So we go through it, we see the first part was a photo of the condition. Now this was upstate New York, and the client was a girl at the time. I believe she was like only 12 years old, and she was playing at around 9 or 10 p.m. in the grass with other kids playing tag, and all of a sudden she felt like a sudden sharp pain to her leg, along with seeing blood, and her sneakers were covered in blood. And it turned out that they had this pipe in the grass, and the pipe was broken and jagged, and they knew about it and they didn't fix it. And we actually learned through discovery by interviewing a former manager of this, it's like a trailer park home. I think it's like 300 or 400 homes. And one of the former managers told us that the owner actually rented the equipment to start fixing these pipes, because the pipes were bringing water underneath the park out to the nearby reservoir or river. And so it was like $400 a week to rent this equipment, and he started fixing them, but then he was so cheap he didn't want to keep paying the $400, so he said, okay, whatever, I don't care, they're just going to come and repossess this equipment, and then obviously once they do that, he's not going to be able to keep fixing it. And that's what happened. He didn't fix it, and then a child got hurt. So we had photos of the pipe, photos of the defective condition, and then we had photos of her leg showing the laceration. It was like above the foot area, so like kind of where the toes would be, but it was up here on the foot. And it was a laceration that required a few stitches and a hospitalization. Because, you know, sometimes you have a cut and you have a few stitches and everything heals, and cases like that are worth like $10,000, $20,000, not more than that. But this one left a scar, a serious and permanent scar, and it also led to CRPS, the complex regional pain syndrome. So what we did was we created a timeline of all the medical care, and it wasn't that much. There was an emergency room visit in July. Then in August, there was the removal of stitches at a different hospital. Then in November, there was just a visit to a hospital, like a follow-up, where a doctor said, well, the wound has a little bit of partial separation. Then 3 years later, there's a pediatric neurology, just like a well visit to like your family doctor, a pediatric neurologist, because remember, she's only 12 when it happened, so at 15 years old, she sees this pediatric neurologist, and he says that she does have like a slight nerve injury. Then the next year, in February of the following year, there's a visit to the defendant's independent medical examiner, who's really the defense expert, and he says that she does feel pins and needles, electrical sensations, and pain and discomfort. And then in March, 2 years later, so now we're talking about 6 years after the injury, she visits a neurologist who diagnoses her with CRPS and RSD, which is reflex sympathetic dystrophy, now known as complex regional pain syndrome. And he does it through the use of something called an SSRI, a sympathetic skin response, which is kind of similar to an EMG, where they put in those like stickers and they run currents through you, and the current is supposed to track the long or the large nerve fibers. But the sympathetic skin response is the same thing, but it tracks the small nerve fibers. Because remember, she had pain like in her foot and near the surface of the skin in that one localized area where she had the cut, and those are not the large nerve fibers that you would test similar to an EMG or an MCV, but this is an SSRI, so he did that test as well. A lot of what, I talked about, this is my opening statement slides, were just like, what is the sympathetic nervous system and what does it control? Things like dilated pupils or inhibiting salivation, or it relaxes the bronchi, increases the heartbeat, slows down digestion, reduces blood flow. And then I explained the complex regional pain syndrome as almost like an electrical circuit, like the way you have an electrical circuit in your house, let's say, but you have it in your body. So your brain communicates a pain impulse and it triggers an impulse in the sympathetic nervous system. So let's say you have the injury in your foot, like my client. So the original injury initiates a pain impulse, and then that goes to the CNS, right? The central nervous system. So that goes to the brain. Then your brain sends the impulse in turn to the sympathetic nervous system, which is the spinal cord. And there's a sympathetic chain of nerves that then send a signal to the sympathetic nervous system. Impulse triggers the inflammatory response in the blood vessels, and then that sends it back to swelling and increased pain in that area, like the foot, where everything is happening. And then the foot sends another response to the brain, to the central nervous system, and it just keeps going, right? So it's kind of like an electrical system. Let's say you have an alarm in your house, right, for when you're not home and everything should be locked and you want to have safety, so you have an alarm. But let's say the alarm doesn't work in a certain room, like she had the injury in her foot. Let's say it doesn't work in your bedroom. And in your bedroom, even if you're home and the alarm's not even on, it just keeps going off. Ding, 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 ding. This alarm keeps going off, and it's a false alarm. So that's kind of how it works with CRPS. And the pain triggers another response, establishing a cycle of pain and swelling, and it just keeps going. So basically, that's what I did. I kind of explained what it is, that it's a form of chronic pain that usually affects an arm or a leg, and that it's a severely disabling condition that affects the limbs after an injury. And clinical studies of objective pain scales have concluded that CRPS is among the most severe pain disorders that there are, and the condition that waxes and wanes. It gets worse, it gets better. And then the National Institute of Health actually described the typical CRPS pain as burning, pins and needles, and electrical shock. And then there's something known as the Budapest criteria, which is I believe it's the International Association of Pain. And they had a bunch of doctors and they all met in Budapest, Hungary, and they came up with criteria, 4 different things to be able to diagnose CRPS. It doesn't mean you have to use the criteria. Sometimes if you have 2 out of the 4, that's enough to diagnose it. Some doctors do use the criteria, some doctors don't and use their own criteria. But the 4 sensory elements, or the 4 elements are, number 1, sensory, things like allodynia, which is pain normally, pain but from things that normally would not give you pain, such as just touch, temperature, movement. So it's a heightened pain sensitivity. 2 is vasomotor, and that just means there's a difference in skin temperature. So for example, her foot, when you took the temperature, was different than the rest of her body. The 3rd one is pseudomotor, and that means there are changes or asymmetry in swelling or in sweating. So the way you sweat, the way that things swell. And then the 4th one is motor or trophic, and that just means that there's decreased movements and you get motor symptoms like tremors or weakness, and you have changes in your hair, skin, or nails, which she did not have because she's so young. But the doctor said that she could have that later on. And so it's basically linked to nerve damage in an affected area. You get increased pain, you get changes in skin color, you get swelling, changes in skin temperature, decreased function, and this issue with nail growth or nail loss. And so the signs and symptoms are pain, severe, disproportional to the injury, constant, neuropathic, and hypersensitive. And then we talked about different things like allodynia, pain from a non-painful stimuli. She had pain when she took a shower, so the shower water would just hit her foot and she would have pain. She would have pain when she put on her jeans, just from the jeans touching the area. So basically we went through all the different parts of the criteria and we showed how it works and how the small nerve fiber, it's a neuropathy that affects the sensory nerves. So we got into a little bit of detail explaining dorsal root ganglions, which is kind of like a central hub where all the nerves meet, and then the nerves go out, and then from the dorsal root ganglion you'll have the nerves getting smaller with the small fibers and nerve endings. And so we kind of geeked out a little bit about that and explained it. And then the peripheral nervous system, we showed some slides about that. And we showed that what this particular client had, which was pain from the non-painful stimuli, decreased sensation, numbness, pain and discomfort to the touch, pins and needles, as well as burning. And we went over the clinical criteria for CRPS. And then we talked about what to expect in the trial, what the evidence will show, because that was the opening statement. Then we, of course, had witnesses. We had the client testify, we had a doctor testify, we cross-examined the defense doctor, and then we had closing argument. I believe that was only 3 witnesses in this case. It was a fairly quick case, just a few days of trial. In the closing argument, we had to summarize, or what they call marshal the evidence, go through everything that's happened in the trial. And we made the case about personal responsibility because we said, look, imagine there's a boy and the boy is playing baseball and he hits a baseball and he breaks the neighbor's window. Is it enough to just go over to the neighbor and say, I'm sorry, and that's it? We said, no, it's not enough. What you really have to do is you have to go over there and you have to say, I'm sorry, I admit it, I won't do it again, and let me make it right. Let me pay for your window. Let me work it off, or let me give you whatever, $100 to fix this window. That's complete, full repentance and proper personal responsibility. And that's not what they're trying to do, because the defendants were essentially admitting liability because they saw how egregious the conduct was of this guy, right, who was had the machine right there and he doesn't want to pay the money to rent it anymore. So they thought that not admitting liability would be worse for them. So they admitted the liability, but then they just said, oh, the injury is not real, or the injury is not from this. Mostly they said the injury is just not real, that you're making this all up, you're malingering, you're conjuring up these false things, that you're fine. You don't have anything wrong with you. And so we talked about personal responsibility, and then we talked about corporate responsibility of this company, of this large community with 400 homes, not taking responsibility and just playing the blame game or deflecting blame. And some of the things they were saying were that she took out the stitches herself, which isn't true. She had a family friend who was a doctor who just looked at it and tried to take out one stitch. And then as soon as she said, no, that's painful, she said, okay, go ahead and go to a hospital. And then everything was done at a hospital. That she doesn't really have this CRPS, that she has something else. And that was interesting because the defense expert, he actually flew up from a foreign country, and he was this older doctor, 70 years old, and he was semi-retired, and he came up and he said, it's not CRPS. Well, what is it, doctor? It's something else. But what else? And he couldn't say, he just said something else. So I thought it was just kind of funny because their own experts have no idea. And then the expert had to say the objective tests are wrong, like the SSRI. You can't fake that, right? It's like electrical stimulation to these small nerve fibers. He's saying it's wrong. Okay, but how is the objective test wrong? And where's your objective test to combat that, right? They have no evidence. And then they said that the temperature difference wasn't enough because her temperature difference from her left foot to her right foot was 0.03 degrees, and that she started treating later, that she didn't have enough treatment. So I said, this is almost like an invitation to get into a mud spring and throw mud, right? Like when you try to throw something up against the wall and you see what sticks. So I'm like, look, they have all these arguments. They're just trying to throw up against the wall and see if any of these arguments sticks with you and you buy any of these baloney arguments. And then that means that this poor girl's not going to have her day in court and she's not going to get justice. So I said, forget about all that stuff that they're trying to throw up against the wall. Don't even look at it, and look at the signals of truth in the noise. And then we went through the timeline, went through the medical records where we talked about what happened in detail. And then basically we went back to the signs and symptoms, that she had allodynia, the pain from things that should not be painful, decreased sensation, a nerve injury. She was numb. She had something called dysesthesia. Dysesthesia is when your sensations of touch become distorted, and pain from taking a shower, pain from putting on sneakers. It felt like a wasp or a bee was stinging her. It felt like a thumbtack, and the pain was a 9 out of 10. And she had hyperpathia, which is the exaggerated sensation of pain, such as from a little bit of heat or a shower. Yeah, so basically we went back and we went over those SSR tests, the sympathetic skin response and they show the waves. And she had a skin SSR that was normal, right? It was 161 at 60 milliamps, and at 100 milliamps, it was 82, and at 100 milliamps, it was 38. So those are actually normal numbers, right? Because you're seeing the responses. But in her left foot, that was the injured foot, she had, at 60 milliamps, it was only 23 compared to 161. And at 100 milliamps, it was only 9 compared to 82. So you could see there's loss of feeling, there's numbness there. And at 100 milliamps, at 50 ms, it was only 3, whereas in the normal one, it was 38.9. We talked about pilot light pain, that it's almost like a pilot light, and the pain is always there, but sometimes it flares up and it becomes like a full-blown inferno and it gets worse. Yeah, and then we just basically talked about what the case could be worth, and I gave a little bit of a story about the man in the museum that imagined like there's a fire at the Louvre. It's a really bad fire. The entire Louvre Museum in Paris is burning. The fire marshal is there with the museum owner or the curator, and he says, you know, there's something really important in that museum. There's a Picasso painting worth $50 million. Go in and get it before this thing burns to the ground. And now like the pillars are burning, the wood is burning, the frame is burning, the thing is about done. And so the guy runs in there, the fireman runs in there, and he looks and he sees the Picasso hanging on the wall, and underneath the Picasso he sees a little girl sitting there. So he grabs a little girl, he throws her over his shoulder, and he runs outside the museum. And then the curator sees the fire marshal, the fireman, so he says, oh my God, and now the building is just completely burned. It's just, the roof is now on fire. There's no way you could even go in anymore. It's gone. So the museum curator says, oh my God, you idiot. You left the Picasso. That's a masterpiece. That's one of a kind. But then he shows him the little girl and he says, well, she's one of a kind too. And she's made by the greatest master of all, you know? So I don't know. When I said that in closing, I kind of got a little bit teary-eyed because it was like emotional, because I really felt for the client. I really cared about her. So I think that kind of hit hard, that resonated. And I showed a picture of the Picasso with the picture of the client next to each other. And then we went into things like loss of enjoyment of life, like the effect that a plaintiff's injuries have on her ability to enjoy life, such as the loss of the ability to perform daily tasks, to participate in activities that were part of life before the injury, and to experience the pleasures of life, like happiness. And then we got into things that she did, like she would run, play dance, do gymnastics. She liked to kiteboard, go to the beach. And yeah, we actually talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we said it's a forever injury. It's permanent, there's no cure, it's lifelong, it's painful, and it will only get worse. And she's only 18 at the time of the trial, a young girl. And then we showed like an iceberg, and we showed like, you know, you could see the tip of the iceberg, right? That's what's outside the water, but the huge part of the iceberg is under the water, and you don't see that. And what about all the things that we didn't think about, her life and how it's affecting her? And then we just basically said the human losses to date, because under the pattern jury instructions, plaintiff is entitled to recover a sum of money which will justly and fairly, now those are the important words under New York law, justly and fairly compensate her for any injury, disability, and conscious pain and suffering from the date of the injury up until the trial. So we broke it down as physical impairment, injury, pain and suffering, disfigurement, and loss of enjoyment of life, and we said $200,000 was fair for the past. And then for the future, we actually looked at a 1961 cost of living, where a new house in 1961 is $12,500. The average income is $5,315 a year. A new car is $2,849. The average rent is $110 a month. Tuition to Harvard University is $1,250 a year, right? Gasoline is 27 cents a gallon. A postage stamp is 4 cents. A movie ticket is $1. Vitamin D milk is $1 a gallon. Ground coffee is 85 cents a pound. You know, you get the idea. So then we said, but that's the same number of years, because the trial was in 2023. So you had 23 plus to 1961, right? So that's what, another 40. So I guess, it was a total of about 61.2 years. So we said, look at what it will be 61.2 years into the future. The only way we could do it is if we look 61.2 years into the past, in 1961, and you see how the prices are different. So now plaintiff is entitled to recover a sum of money which will justly and fairly compensate her for any injury, disability, and conscious pain and suffering into the future. And we broke it down the same way, the physical impairment, the disfigurement, the loss of enjoyment of life, and we said 900,000 was fair. And so total was 1.1 million. And the verdict was actually, I believe, 535,000. So it was less than we had thought, it was less than we told the jury. But we told the jury, look, we believe civil justice in this case is 1.1 million. You can give more, you can give less. Ultimately, it's your decision after listening to all the evidence. And I believe they gave 25,000, or was it 35,000? 35,000 maybe passed, but for the future they gave 500,000. So the total was 535. And then we said, look, the defendants are trying to say that reasonable is cheap. That, you know, be reasonable, just give her a reasonable amount. Look, she only went to the doctor once or twice, just give her like 20,000 total. That's what the defendants were saying. And we said, no, reasonable is fair and reasonable is full. Reasonable is the full value of what something is worth, especially if it's a life-changing forever injury in a young girl. And if you break it, if you cause this, then you kind of like, you break it, you buy it, you have to pay for it. You have to pay for all the harms and losses. And reasonable is just, you know, justice. And reasonable is also not a discount. Reasonable doesn't have to be a discount. So that was basically it. So I thought the case illustrated CRPS in an interesting way because we explained it, we had the medical testimony, and I could do another video where we actually go through, for example, the testimony on direct examination of the doctor and how he explained what CRPS is and his actual testimony, because I believe we have the transcript, so we could do a video about that, as well as the cross-examination of the defendant's DME, defense medical, or what they call IME, independent medical examiner, and what are the points that we hit to discredit that doctor. So please like and subscribe to our channel. Let us know what questions you have. We are here for you. Our goal is helping serious injury victims and families.